Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on private practice. My name is Annette Johns, and I am the Associate Director of Policy and Practice with the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers. I am joined by my social work colleague, Simone Pelly, who works as a private practitioner in Central Newfoundland. Simone is Chair of the NLCSW Ethics Committee and also a member of the NLCSW Editorial Committee. I've had the honor of working with Simone over the years, and we have had many thoughtful and invigorating ethical and practice discussions. Simone and I have previously presented together, and I'm so thankful that she agreed to co-facilitate this webinar with me today. A recording of this session will be available in the coming days on the NLCSW YouTube channel. The slides and additional practice resources can be downloaded from the resource section on the webinar platform. This webinar is 1.5 CPE credits under the required category workshop. We encourage you to enter this in the Update My CPE section of your My NLCSW account that you use for registration. This will certainly make registration renewal so much easier when you hit the transfer button and all your CPE is submitted. At any time throughout the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A tab on the webinar platform. There's also a chat platform, chat function, but please use the Q&A just to ensure that we don't miss any of your questions. So we want to begin the presentation this afternoon by setting the context and really look at, begin with a definition of what private practice is. And this is a definition that was approved by the NLCSW board in 2018. And it defines private practice as the provision of social work services on a full or part-time basis by a registered social worker who is self-employed, a member of a partnership or group practice, or an independent contractor. Social workers in private practice are autonomous and responsible for the quality of social work services and ensuring compliance with legislation, codes of ethics, and standards of practice. Services in private practice are provided on a fee-for-service model that is mutually agreed to by a client or third party, so for example, insurance companies, employee assistance programs or organizations, or as set out in contract. And this definition is really quite broad and covers private practice in its broadest sense. So based on that definition, we want to know how many of you joining us today are currently engaged in private practice. And for that, we have your first polling question, where it just simply asks if you are engaged in private practice. And we'll give you a moment there to fill that out, so yes or no. And that could include full-time private practice, part-time private practice, and so forth. So we're just waiting for some of the results to come in there now. And as you can see, we have 66% of those of you who are joining us today are currently not engaged in private practice, whereas 33% of you are. So that's really good information to know, and we're hoping that regardless of where you are on that spectrum, if you're someone who's just starting private practice or just thinking about private practice, or you're a seasoned private practitioner, we're hoping that the material today will be of benefit to you. So thanks for letting us know that. So during our time this afternoon, we are going to review some of the practice considerations that are unique to private practice, provide an overview of applicable standards of practice, explore some of the ethical consideration, and offer some practice resources that will be helpful to you as you work as a private practitioner, or again, if you're thinking about this as an area of practice. In 2014, the NLCSW produced a private practice resource guide that was most recently updated in April 2020. This is a living document that is regularly updated based on best practices and discussions with members. If you haven't already done so, I would encourage you to read through this document. It is included in the resource section of the webinar and really does form the basis of the content for today's presentation. Social workers enter private practice for a variety of reasons, and there are many benefits, including increased autonomy and independence in their practice, greater flexibility in work hours or number of clients. So you might engage in private practice and only see 1 or 2 clients a week, or you might be engaged in private practice full-time. And there's all the time, and the spectrum covers that quite broadly. There's also an ability to specialize in a specific area. You may want to, initiate a private practice in response to some community or organizational need that you've identified, or to supplement other employment or volunteer work. It is important, though, that when thinking about private practice, that you reflect on what you see as your reason for wanting to engage in private practice, and to really look at if this is going to assess your personal and professional goals. While private practice does have benefits, there's also many issues and considerations that need to be explored when engaging in independent practice, and this is what we're going to be talking about today throughout the presentation. But before I go on, I'm going to turn it over to Simone for some comments around benefits of private practice.
Thanks, Annette. Over the last 5 years, I actually discovered there's far less autonomy than one might expect in private practice. My practice is entirely market-driven. This means that the market demands how my work is organized. In order to be responsive to clients' needs, my practice requires me to work evenings to provide therapy for those who work or attend school through the day. And in central Newfoundland, there's almost zero demand for weekend appointments due to the high level of participation in recreational activities. Since I provide cognitive behavior therapy to people who have immediate mental health needs or specific mental illness, the market demands a timely response to service. My practice motto is strike when iron is hot, as people call for service when they're ready to engage, and timelines are essential to help people get back on track and meet the demands of their lives. Now, there may be more flexibility if one maintained a part-time practice, but a high level of responsiveness is required where I live to maintain a full-time practice. In private practice, accountability shifts from the employer to the client as the consumer, and therefore my continued employment depends on meeting the expectations of the client as negotiated in the first session through the process of informed consent. And then regular feedback is required in each CBT session, and then this kind of provides an ongoing quality assurance to meet the client's needs.
Okay, thank you, Simone. So private practice is a professional and business venture. And as an entrepreneur, social workers in private practice need to consider all the business aspects of running an independent practice that would normally be handled by an employer. For example, accounting practices, tax remittances, rental agreements, insurance, record storage and security, fee schedules, administrative tasks, etc. Social workers considering private practice are encouraged to develop a business plan and implement accounting practices, seek clarification around accounting and services such as HST exempt services from Revenue Canada, and obtain legal questions as appropriate. It's not the role of the NLCSW to advise members on these business pieces, and what we want to talk to you about today are considerations related to the private practice of social work. So we have another polling question for you there's 3 options in terms of yes, no, I'm not sure. And if you do you believe that private practice requires a separate level of licensure? So again, we'll just give you a few minutes to complete that polling question. So again, it's yes, no, or I'm not sure. Just going to give it a few minutes for the responses to come in. Like the polling questions are just moving slightly, so I think we're ready to move on. So it's interesting. 47% of people who are attending the webinar today believe that private practice requires a separate level of licensure. 26% said no, and 26% said they weren't sure. So we're going to try to answer that for you now. So in this province, a separate level of licensure is not needed to engage in private practice. To work as a private practitioner, one must be a registered social worker with the NLCSW. While the Bachelor of Social Work sets the minimum education requirement for social work registration in this province, NLCSW recommends that those entering private practice have a Master of Social Work and at least 3 years of social work experience relevant to the proposed area of practice. One of the key factors to consider when thinking about private practice is competency. As noted in the CASW Code of Ethics, social workers demonstrate due care for clients' interest and safety by limiting professional practice to areas of demonstrated competence. The 2018 Standards of Practice for Social Workers in Newfoundland and Labrador also highlights the need for social workers to ensure they have the necessary skills to carry out their work efficiently and effectively, that they provide clients with information pertaining to their education and area of expertise and competence, and that social workers continually assess when a client's needs are outside the parameters of their expertise. So in thinking about one's competence to engage in private practice, the following reflective questions are important. What is my experience in the practice area that I'm interested in? Is it mental health and addictions? Is it trauma-informed practice? Is it family therapy, couples counseling, organizational development, conflict resolution? And what is the primary treatment modality? Is it cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, narrative, solution-focused, and so on? So when thinking, so important to think through that in terms of what is the experience and expertise that I'm going to bring to this particular area of practice. What formal training or continuing education have I completed? What professional development opportunities exist in this area? And how am I going to address gaps in my learning and in my knowledge? Do I have access to consultation and supervision, which we're going to talk about later on in the presentation? And what standards and guidelines should I be knowledgeable about? Again, we're going to touch on some of those throughout the presentation. So hopefully that answered that question for people who were unsure about that. Now we have another polling question. We really want to get you guys engaged this afternoon. So we're looking at this question. If working as a private practitioner, can I use the title licensed clinical social worker? And this is a question that we've gotten quite frequently from members, so we thought we'd incorporate it into the presentation this afternoon. So again, your choices are yes, no, or I'm unsure. So we'll just give you another couple minutes to kind of look at that question, what your thoughts are around that. See, the results are coming in there now. Okay, I think they're almost ready to stop. I just see some movement there with the answers, so I'll just give it another second or two, and then we'll look. Okay. So 42% indicated that yes, they can use the title licensed clinical social worker. 23% indicated no, and 30% noted they weren't sure. So again, I hope I'll be able to clarify this question for you as well. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, the title social worker and registered social worker is reserved for those who are registered with the NLCSW as outlined in the Social Workers Act. Social work registration is required to use the title and practice within the scope of the profession. And when marketing one's private practice, it's important that social workers list their credentials and their title. So that could be MSW, RSW, MSW social worker, and that will be followed by one's area of expertise and what principal services they offer. And this is what assures clients that they are receiving services from a qualified and licensed professional who have met the criteria to practice social work in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's important to note, though, that titles like licensed clinical social worker are not legislative titles under the Social Workers Act in this province. Some U.S. states and Canadian jurisdictions may grant the use of these titles as per their licensing or registration categories for use in their jurisdiction. And so the use of these titles here in Newfoundland and Labrador may be confusing to clients and members of the public and what their expectations are around service delivery. So registered social worker is the professional title here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And by using the RSW title, you're promoting social work and the knowledge and expertise of the social work profession here in the province. So again, I hope that that answered that question for anyone who was wondering. So it is a requirement for those who are engaged in private practice to have the appropriate professional liability insurance. And this requirement is outlined in the Social Workers Act, the CASW Guidelines for Ethical Practice, and the 2018 Standards of Practice for Social Workers in Newfoundland and Labrador. And members can avail of professional liability insurance through CASW's Professional Liability Insurance Program, and the insurance provider is BMS Group. And anyone wanting more information about that can just log on to the CASW website at CASW and sublink for the BMSW group.com. So CASW.bmsgroup.com. Now I'm going to hand it over to Simone.
All right. Because services that are delivered privately are a fee for service, it's important that social workers in private practice have a fee structure that is fully disclosed to clients at the onset of the social worker-client relationship and is necessary throughout the duration of the relationship. As noted in the CASW Guidelines for Ethical Practice, social workers should disclose at the onset of the relationship the fee schedule for social work services, including their expectations and practices with respect to cancellations and unpaid bills. They should only charge a fee that was disclosed to and agreed upon by the client, and they should charge only for the reasonable hours of client services, research, consultation, administrative work on behalf of a given client. When I started my practice, I conducted a market survey. So a market survey, it's an essential business strategy to maintain competitiveness. I surveyed the local service providers and based on their qualifications and fee services, and then I based my decision on a service fee that reflected my qualifications. Then I set up my website clearly articulating my qualifications and experience so that clients can evaluate what I'm offering and make an informed decision when choosing a provider. All right. So social work documentation is an ethical and legal responsibility for all social workers. Social workers in private practice must develop documentation policies that are in keeping with the standards and ethics of the profession, and they meet obligations under the Personal Health Information Act, of which social workers in private practice are custodians of personal health information under this act. Now, the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers recommends that records be kept for a minimum of 7 to 10 years. And social workers need to use a professional judgment in determining if the file, in fact, needs to be kept longer for a longer time frame. So, for example, you might want to keep in mind any anticipated requirements for being called into court, for example. It's also important to have policies pertaining to record retention, security, and client access. Where will the records be stored? Will there be paper or electronic records? What security measures are taken to ensure that records are protected and secure? How can clients access their records? How are requests from clients for a copy of their clinical record handled? So you have to take into consideration such as things as like vetting third-party information or the administrative fees and for the time that it takes to be able to reproduce or copy the files and get them sent out to where they're requested. These are all elements of documentation and file retention that social workers in private practice must develop. In particular, my notes, they follow the session format of cognitive behavior therapy. and they're almost entirely recorded during the session. This gives me the opportunity to capture direct quotes of clients' thought content, preserving the original intent of their thoughts without relying on my memory, because that can be distorted by my own bias. And it cuts down on paperwork requirements in between sessions. How notes are recorded and stored, and under what conditions notes are shared, is discussed at the beginning of the service through the process of informed consent. The process is revisited over and over again as needed during the course of therapy. Right, so we'll go to the next slide now.
Okay, and I was just going to interject there and just say that in thinking about documentation and informed consent, the NLCSW Ethics Committee developed a self-assessment tool on informed consent and documentation that social workers can use to reflect on and evaluate their practices. And this tool is available on the NLCSW website under Practice Resources. The NLCSW has also produced a number of practice resources on the topic of informed consent and documentation, including, Practice Matters. And in 2016, 3 of the Practice Matters publications focused on informed consent, resolving conflicts of interest through informed consent, and social work documentation. And Documentation Matters is an initiative of the NLCSW Ethics Committee. And the purpose of that resource is to offer documentation tips for social workers in a short and concise format. And the publications have included, how do I know if I'm recording too much or too little? So that was the focus of the most recent publication. What things should I consider in the documentation of informed consent? And what things should I consider pertaining to documentation of electronic social work services? Another initiative of the NLCSW Ethics Committee is the Ethical Compass, and that's another great ethical resource for members. And the latest publication of Ethical Compass that was just released in September addressed the issue of disclosing client information. And all of these practice resources are available on the NLCSW website under Practice Resources. And in relation to another thing I want to tell you about in relation to documentation is that we did hold 2 webinars in 2019 on the topic of documentation, one by Ellen Oliver on documentation and critical thinking, and one by the NLCSW Ethics Committee on documentation and professional standards. And both of the recordings from these webinars are available on the NLCSW YouTube channel.
Okay. As we know, informed consent is integral to the therapeutic alliance between a client and social worker, and is in keeping with the client's right to self-determination, autonomy, dignity, privacy, and respect. Oh, I think I've mixed up my pages here. While having an informed consent document is often beneficial, it's important to note that the process of informed consent goes beyond the client's signature on a form and involves an ongoing dialogue with the client about services being provided, the risks and benefits of the proposed intervention, the anticipated length of time for the intervention, how termination will be handled, information on client confidentiality, and the limits to confidentiality, and how social work records will be maintained. Being transparent about one's area of expertise is also important, and how the issues that fall outside of this expertise will be addressed. In my practice, I introduce informed consent in a written document at the beginning of the first session, but it's revisited constantly throughout the sessions of therapy. The entirety of the first session is the process of assessment where the client and I work together to focus on the needs of the client and the expectations for service to determine if cognitive therapy is even appropriate for the client. So the client identifies their goals for therapy, and I propose a treatment plan based on the cognitive model to help them achieve their goals. Client feedback is reviewed at the start and end of each session to collaboratively evaluate if the sessions are on track and meeting the needs of the client. It's never assumed that a client will return for another session. It's through the process of feedback that continued service is determined. On another note, informed consent is an excellent way to model appropriate communication and boundaries in a therapeutic relationship, as in any relationship. In therapy, there's actually a dual process that's occurring. So that's where you're working together with the client on the content of the sessions, which is basically focusing on the goals that a person's pursuing through the course of treatment, but also the process of the session between the therapist and the client. As social workers, our behaviors in a professional context model what an effective relationship can look like with clear and direct communication of expectations. Well, social workers seek informed consent from clients prior to the delivery of the social work services and throughout the duration of the relationship. Social workers document clients' informed consent in the client record and update it as necessary. Social workers must also evaluate a client's capacity to give informed consent as early in the relationship as possible and throughout the duration of the social work relationship. And social workers provide clients with information on the social work services being provided, the risks and benefits of the proposed intervention, and alternative options. Social workers provide clients with clear information on how long the proposed intervention will take, and social workers provide information on the limits of confidentiality. And as Annette had mentioned, and I'm not sure in talking about some of the documents that we have on the NLCSW website, there are also practice matter publications on informed consent, resolving conflicts of interest through informed consent, and also I believe if you go online as well and look at the ethical compass, that there's some discussion there as well on informed consent. Annette, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that was perfect. Thanks, Simone.
So the NLCSW, I guess it uses this title now, the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers, often receive questions from members regarding informed consent with children and youth. In 2019, the NLCSW produced a practice guideline to assist social workers in navigating this issue in practice. While organizations may have specific policies in place, social workers in private practice must use their own knowledge and professional judgment when providing therapy or counseling to minors. So this document outlines factors to consider in the assessment of a mature minor, ethical decision-making, practice considerations, and documentation. You can access this document as well on the NLCSW website under Practice Resources.
Okay, thanks, Simone. So we're going to switch focus now and look at the whole area of technology use. If you're using or thinking about incorporating technology use for the delivery of social work services through your private practice, it is important to be aware of and adhere to the standards for technology use. And the NLCSW hosted a webinar recently on the topic of technology use in social work practice that's now available on our YouTube channel, and a Practice Matters publication on electronic social work services that was released in June. So a question that we often receive is, does NLCSW recommend or approve different virtual platforms for social workers to use in practice? I just want to make a note that no, the NLCSW does not recommend, approve, or limit the use of the various technological platforms that exist. There are numerous technology programs that are available for service delivery, and social workers may prefer one that works best for them and for their clientele. And each platform is unique, and questions pertaining to client privacy and confidentiality must be considered when choosing a platform that best meets your needs. For example, you might want to ensure that the technology you're using is compliant with the Personal Health Information Act. It's also important to obtain informed consent from clients when using technology in service delivery. In addition to the issues covered as part of ongoing informed consent for in-person sessions, social workers using technology should also ensure that the technological platform they're using, what technological platform they're using, any risks and benefits from electronic service delivery, including limitations of the technology that you're using, policies around privacy and confidentiality. For example, clients may want to know what you're doing to protect their privacy. Are you going to be sending things through encrypted email? How is their personal health information going to be stored? What will happen in the event of a technological failure? Is there a backup plan? Does the social worker have up-to-date information to connect with the clients if the technology fails? How electronic communication pertaining to emergencies or time-sensitive matters will be handled. For example, letting clients know how often messages are checked in between sessions and the type of communication that's really appropriate for communication technology. And having this information documented in the client file is very important so that clients are aware of what the policy is and everything is open and transparent. And this in and of itself can help mitigate boundary issues or challenges later on. So BMS, which I noted at the beginning, BMS Group, the professional liability insurer through CASW, developed an informed consent template at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic that social workers could use when they began to incorporate or increase their use of technology into their practices. This consent form is not specific, though, to COVID-19 and can be used and adapted for your practice. However, as Simone noted, while forms are helpful and beneficial, informed consent is truly about having a dialogue with clients, ensuring they understand the information, and having the ability to ask clarifying questions. So anyone who is interested in seeing that form, it is available on the NLCSW website under the COVID-19 section. So here at the office, we continue to receive inquiries from members about interjurisdictional practice. Examples of the types of questions have included: a client from NL moves to another province and would like to maintain the therapeutic relationship with the social worker through electronic means. A client is working on rotation in another province and would like to access services while in the other jurisdiction. A social worker is contracted to provide EAP services, and this would involve clients from multiple jurisdictions. Or a social worker is providing group therapy, and there are clients from other jurisdictions involved. An interjurisdictional practice is addressed in the standards of practice for social workers in Newfoundland and Labrador, and does note that social workers who provide services across jurisdictions must comply with the regulatory requirements in the jurisdiction where the social worker resides and the jurisdiction where the client resides. That social workers engaged in interjurisdictional practice have the appropriate liability insurance, and also that they're aware and comply with legislation and reporting requirements, for example, reporting child protection concerns in the jurisdiction where the client is residing. So the NLCSW does have a listing of the Canadian social work regulatory bodies on our website, and for those who do have professional liability insurance through CASW's professional liability insurer, electronic practice across jurisdictions is covered as long as you follow the regulatory requirements for electronic practice in that jurisdiction where the client is. So for example, if you have a client who is in Alberta, you need to contact the Alberta College of Social Workers to inquire about what regulatory requirements exist in that province. In many jurisdictions, the fee to provide electronic services in their jurisdiction is nominal or is offered on a courtesy basis, and there are only a few jurisdictions that would require a higher registration fee. So don't let that be a barrier in terms of providing interjurisdictional practice. You just need to connect with the regulatory bodies and make sure you're meeting all the regulatory requirements that's needed. Okay, switching focus again here now, looking at conflicts of interest. In our practices, it's important to be aware of situations that can create real potential or perceived conflicts of interest. When we look at conflicts of interest, we need to consider issues related to the workplace, but also professional relationships. In relation to workplaces, a common question we often receive from social workers in private practice who are also employed with organizations providing health or social service delivery, for example, a regional health authority, is whether they can provide services to agency clients privately. The CASW Guidelines for Ethical Practice and the Standards for Practice does speak to this issue. The guidance is that social workers do not accept clients from their workplaces unless there's an explicit request from one's employer or a similar service is not provided by one's employer. And in situations where this service is requested by a client, social workers should consult with their employer regarding their conflict of interest policy and have a discussion with a supervisor or a manager about that. In situations where agency referrals are made to one's private practice and in keeping with the value of integrity in social work practice, it's important that these requests be documented and ensure that the agency and the client is aware of the social worker's documentation policy and how information may be shared as part of the informed consent process. In relation to professional relationships, NLCSW continues to provide ethical consultations to members, and conflicts of interest within professional relationships is a common theme. NLCSW has produced many ethical resources on this topic, including articles in Connecting Voices and Practice Matters publications. As outlined in the CASW Guidelines for Ethical Practice, social workers avoid conflicts of interest that interfere with the exercise of professional discretion and impartial judgment. Social workers who anticipate a conflict of interest based on the nature of their work, for example, individual versus family therapy, must inform clients about the potential conflict and develop a strategy to address this conflict. Some of the issues that have arisen through the ethical consultation process has included handling of friend requests from clients on Facebook or outside of Facebook, and the development of social media policies, evaluating potential for dual and multiple relationships, so for example, providing service to a friend or family member, providing individual counseling to a couple that's been seen for couples counseling initially, and providing services to former clients one worked with prior to the establishment of their private practice. Resolving these dilemmas in practice does require a review of ethical responsibilities and identifying what ethical standards are applicable to the situation. Using ethical decision-making models, seeking appropriate consultation is also recommended. And this is really where the informed consent process becomes so important in terms of assessing the nature of the conflict, maintaining professional boundaries, and being transparent with the client through collaborative dialogue is really key and can help mitigate issues that may come up. Ultimately, though, social workers make decisions that are in the best interest of clients and in keeping with one's values and standards. Before moving on, I just want to touch for a moment on the topic of advertising and client testimonials. Social workers in private practice are increasingly developing professional websites and exploring social media platforms to promote their private practice. Online advertising and marketing is certainly the way of the world. While advertising is not specifically addressed in the Code of Ethics, the Guidelines for Ethical Practice and the Standards of Practice do provide some guidance. As noted in the standards, for example, social workers must ensure they provide clients with clear, accurate, and transparent information about their experience and competence and expertise, and I think we've said that a couple times now throughout the presentation, and not make false or misleading claims about their practice or skill level. For example, attending one webinar on EMDR without additional training or skill development would not deem one skilled or competent in EMDR treatment. Therefore, the guidelines and standards do provide a good framework for evaluating one's online presence and how this might be perceived by those seeking services. When advertising fee-based services, it is crucial that social workers are transparent about their experience and skills in providing the highest quality services. The use of testimonials when advertising is often a debated topic. While in the business world, there are many benefits for using testimonials. We've all seen them. We can all give examples. But when it comes to testimonials from clients receiving social work services, it can become a little murkier and create conflicts of interest or boundary challenges. For example, what happens if the social worker-client relationship becomes challenging and the client no longer agrees with a testimonial that they have written? Or what if a client believes that by writing a testimonial, they have a different or more special relationship with the social worker? What if the client perceives a request for a testimonial as undue pressure and agrees to please the social worker? After all, in ethics, we say it's how a client perceives the situation that becomes their reality, even if it wasn't our intent. And what if a prospective client reading a testimonial from a client enters the relationship with unrealistic expectations for change? Everyone experiences therapy or counseling differently, and if their own experience is not as positive of what was written in a testimonial, how might they internalize that? So acknowledging and reflecting on these potential impacts is important. The posting of client information on the internet or social media platforms in the form of testimonials also warrants caution, particularly as it relates to client confidentiality and privacy. If we know that posting information, even if we're not using their name, their age, or their ethnicity, still may not be enough to protect client confidentiality. Therefore, if client testimonials are used, client informed consent is imperative, and all the considerations would need to be taken into account. And while we don't have a formal position on the use of testimonials, some organizations do. What we want to put across is that it's imperative that as social workers we give due attention to these ethical issues and considerations, and in the end make decisions that are in the best interest of clients. And this is also in keeping with Value 3 of the Code of Ethics, Service to Humanity, and the principle which affirms that social workers place the needs of others above self-interest when acting in a professional capacity.
All right, so we previously mentioned the importance of using the ethical decision-making models when navigating ethical dilemmas in practice. So now we've got another poll for those attending to do. The NLCSW Ethics Committee has developed an ethical decision-making resources document. Are you familiar with this document?
Still seeing the results come in there, Simona?
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. All right. Well, there's another change. Okay, we'll go with that then. All right, so it's almost even. Yes, it would be 54% of you are familiar with the document, and 45% of you are not. So this document was recently updated. It was first done by the Professional Practice Committee, and I think it was about 2015. And the now what's known as the NLCSW Ethics Committee just did an update just recently. So you'll find the updated version on the NLCSW website under Practice Resources. We've heard from social workers, and quite frankly, I'm included in this, that a lot do keep a printed copy of this document on their desk for easy reference. So here's the ethical decision-making model that's included in the document. It basically goes down through 17 very comprehensive questions that basically helps a social worker look at all the different considerations and aspects that might be useful in trying to sort through navigating an ethical dilemma. So there is a more comprehensive presentation on YouTube about this particular model, and I also did a little bit of talk about it in the joint presentation that was done last February with the Nurses Association and also, I believe, the University Ethics. So you can refer to that as a resource as well. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. All right, so there are many laws and pieces of legislation that social workers must be aware of in their practice. So some examples of this would be the Personal Health Information Act, the Children, Youth, and Families Act, the Adult Protection Act, and of course, more recently, what's probably on the forefront of a lot of our minds is the Public Health Protections and Promotions Act. Social workers must be familiar with these laws and comply with the provincial and federal legislation that's applicable to their practice. The NLCSW Private Practice Resource Guide provides a summary of and links to many of the pieces of legislation, and all other legislation can be accessed through the House of Assembly on the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador website. As social workers in private practice, don't have access to an employer who can interpret legislative policies and aid in the decision-making process, social workers are encouraged to seek legal advice if they are unclear about the legal requirements in any given case. For example, if one might be considering reporting requirements under the Family Act. It is important that these consultations be documented as part of the decision-making process. And as documentation is an important risk management strategy. Social workers with professional liability insurance, so the CASW Professional Liability Insurer, which is BMS, can actually access a free 30-minute legal and ethical consultation as part of the insurance. And if you want to read about that a little bit more, you can go to the CASW website. All right. Complementary and adjunct therapies and techniques refer to the intervention by a registered social worker within the context of the social work relationship, which is outside the conventional practice of social work and is not the primary modality of treatment. So this could include approaches or techniques like EMDR, relaxation therapy, play therapy, faith-based counseling, those kinds of things. The NLCSW developed a guideline document social workers could review when incorporating complementary or adjunct therapies in their practice, and this too can be accessed on the NLCSW website. The use of complementary and adjunct therapies and techniques is also addressed in the Standard of Practice for Social Workers in Newfoundland, as noted in the standards. So social workers who use complementary and adjunct therapies and techniques in practice must be competent in the use of these modalities and possess the appropriate skills and judgment for their effective use as demonstrated by their education and training. They must assess whether the intervention is in the best interest of the client, and they must engage in a process of clear, informed consent with the client prior to using these therapies and techniques in practice, including the provision of information on the risks and benefits of engaging in that technique. And they must also maintain appropriate professional boundaries. Okay. So while the need for social work supervision may change over the course of one's career, it never diminishes. As noted in the NLCSW Private Practice Resource Guide, social workers in private practice should seek reasonable and timely access to supervision or peer consultation to foster knowledge and skill development, critical thinking, and self-reflection. The amount of supervision or consultation may depend on factors such as education, knowledge and experience of the social worker, or the risk involved in the practice activity, the stress experienced by the social worker, and or the size and complexity of one's workload. When social workers consult on a complex case and identifying information is being used, it's the responsibility of the social worker to seek the informed consent from the client and have the same documented in the client file. So the NLCSW does not specify or approve how and when this supervision and consultation should occur. It's the responsibility of the social worker to seek appropriate access to supervision consultation, which may include a fee for service or mutual agreement between two parties. In my practice, through the years, I've kept up with my training through cognitive therapy through various sites that are recommended by the organization in which I'm certified through, which is the Academy of Cognitive Therapy. There I'm on a listserv with other world-class experts from around the world, and I can use that as a resource base or a way to get connected and to consult with others. Consultation for me has been really important in terms of actually a kind of professional self-care in maintaining an ethical and a professional level of practice. I also keep connected with the NLCSW through being a part of the editorial committee for Connecting Voices, and being a chair of the ethics committee. And it's the NLCSW has been a great professional support that way, just to stay plugged in on what's current in practice matters.
Great, that's wonderful, Simone. So we're going to switch gears again. We're hoping to cover a lot of information in a very short period of time here this afternoon. So social work and the use of the DSM-5 is an area that tends to create a lot of questions for social workers. It is recognized that some social workers are using the DSM in an informal way to understand the diagnosis of a client they're working with and to inform their own treatment plan for the client, for example, while others may be using it to diagnose in their practice. So the NLCSW developed a guideline document that was released in February of 2020 that social workers can review when looking at this issue in practice. It outlines one's professional responsibilities, areas for consideration, and offers some reflective questions. This is an evolving and sometimes unsettling area within practice, and one that we will continue to explore as we keep abreast of what's happening across the country and in other international jurisdictions. So just going to go through some of the professional responsibilities and areas to consider. So the first one we'll look at is competence. And of course, we know that competence is a key value in the Code of Ethics. And in relation to use of the DSM-5 in practice, social workers must be able to demonstrate that they have the necessary education, knowledge, skill, and competence to effectively use the DSM in their practice and to engage in continuing professional education on its use to ensure clients continue to receive the highest quality services. And this education should really be quite comprehensive in terms of coursework, certificate programs, and comprehensive training workshops. And practice supervision as it relates to competence is also important in terms of the use of the DSM-5. Again, we've noted throughout the presentation about the fundamental importance of informed consent. And as such, social workers using the DSM-5 in practice must seek the informed consent of clients prior to using it in practice to either provide a preliminary diagnosis or a diagnosis. And clients must be given information on the social worker's competency in the use of the DSM-5, any rationale for providing a diagnosis, and how this will be used in their work with a client. So it's really important to focus on competence and informed consent. And other areas of consideration certainly include education supervision, which I've already touched on briefly, really want to note that this would not be considered an entry-level competency if someone's using the DSM-5 in their practice, and at the minimum, someone would need an MSW in clinical social work, at least 5 years of experience in mental health, and access to clinical supervision. The piece around collegial relationships and interdisciplinary practice recognizes the need to consult in the best interest of clients. So whether that's consulting with a colleague, someone with expertise in the use of the DSM, or even a physician around if a client does require medication, for example. And, of course, documentation. It's really important that if you're looking at using the DSM-5 in practice, that you document how you're using the DSM and really have that clear and transparent in your professional notes. And, of course, professional liability insurance. So those who have professional liability insurance as a private practitioner would already have that piece, but anyone who's not currently engaged in private practice would certainly need private professional liability insurance before using the DSM in their practice. So these are some important questions to reflect on when considering how to use the DSM, or if you're going to use the DSM in your practice. And it's not a decision to be taken lightly, and a reflection on the Code of Ethics and standards of practice will be crucial, and consultation with others as well. So just to briefly go through some of these questions, more of a self-reflective piece around assessing if I have the appropriate education and training to diagnose using the DSM. Do I have a thorough understanding of how to use it? So it's not a matter of just saying to someone that, I think you have depression. Well, how did you arrive at that using the DSM? What other conditions were ruled out during that process, for example? What would be my purpose for needing to diagnose in my practice? Is there a relevant purpose? Is there, a real need to do that or not? Am I using the DSM to understand symptomology and guide intervention, which a lot of social workers are doing, or am I using it to provide a diagnosis, and how am I communicating that? How would a diagnosis impact on my work with clients? Another great question to reflect on. Do I have access to supervision and or consultation specifically on the DSM-5? And how do I incorporate this as part of my informed consent process with clients? So it's really about taking a step back, again, looking at the issues, looking at the standards, reflecting, consulting, and making decisions based on that. So, switching gears a little bit again, planning for disruptions in services. And we often get questions pertaining to these elements around, what happens to my practice if I intend on taking a medical or extended leave, or are there things I should be thinking about in terms of if the social worker were to pass away, and what happens to the client files, and if they're thinking about retiring or closing a private practice. So I'll just briefly touch on some of these. So there may be times in one's practice where you might need to take a medical or extended leave. For example, you might be having surgery, or you might be looking after a relative or a child who's sick for an extended period of time. And where possible, clients should receive advance notice to any disruption in services, and then with the informed consent of the clients, making necessary referrals for timely and appropriate access to continuing care. So that's part of a larger discussion, to have with the client if you know that there's going to be a possible extended leave. So a question we have received on several occasions is what can be done to transition clients in the result of the social worker's death. And while the code doesn't specify what to do in those exact situations, social workers should make advance preparations respecting client files, and for this to become part of the informed consent process. So where are their files going to be located? How are they going to access their information? All those pieces. And it's preferable to have files transferred to another social work colleague if possible. But it's also important to seek some legal consultation in that as well, because some may want to have this type of information in terms of what's going to happen to client files and those kinds of things included in a last will and testament, for example, or could be part of a contract with a supervisor. The decision to retire or close a private practice is also one that requires thoughtful consideration and planning. And there are certainly issues to consider around termination of service delivery, referrals, documentation, liability insurance, and just some logistical considerations. And the Private Practice Resource Guide does go through some of these considerations, but I'll just provide some highlights before finishing off the webinar today. So in terms of termination of service delivery, social workers retiring from or closing a private practice really should develop a plan of how and when they will communicate this decision to clients and former clients. Ideally, it will be prudent to give lots of advance notice to allow for adequate termination and appropriate referrals if necessary to ensure that the standard of care is met. Also might be a good practice to inform third-party payers about their decision. So, for example, EAP programs, just letting them know that you're thinking about closing your practice and what the time frame is. And then talking to clients about referrals for service. So a discussion may need to happen with a client about what they want to do once you retire and close your practice, in respecting their self-determination and as part of the effective termination plan and documenting that. So if they want a referral to another practitioner, then you would help to facilitate that. So a closing summary note of treatment goals, client progress, and recommendations moving forward will be important to include in the file, because this is something that then can be shared with the informed consent of clients to a referring practitioner if needed, for example. We would also recommend that social workers retiring from or closing their practice will consult with their professional liability insurer to ensure that appropriate coverage is maintained and there's no gaps in coverage after their practice is closed. So that's a conversation to have with, for example, BMS. Then there's the logistical type questions that you might want to give some consideration to, particularly if you're in the contemplation stage of maybe thinking about retiring or closing your practice, and, how you're going to look at accepting new referrals, and at what point would you not accept a new referral? How will you let new clients know about your intended plan to retire or close your practice? And then deciding how you're going to let clients know that. Is it going to be during a session? Is it going to be a telephone call, a letter to former clients, etc.? And some social workers in private practice may wish to maintain their phone number and email address for several months, for example, with an automatic message about their closure and how clients can contact emergency services during a transition. So these are just all logistical things and important practice considerations to consider as one, contemplates retiring or closing their office. Lots of things to think about. So we're almost to our slides, a couple more slides, and then we'll open up to question and answer. So please feel free, if you have questions, get those questions in, and we'll gladly answer as many as we can. And if we don't know the answer, we'll certainly try to get the answers for you. I want to just look at, when social workers are owners or partners in a private practice. Ultimately, they're responsible for day-to-day operations. So, for example, policies, fee schedules, technology use, documentation, storage, etc. So ensuring that those who provide services to clients through their business, who are part of a regulated profession, are registered and in good standing with their respective regulatory bodies is also important. And addressing concerns about the professional practice of a colleague providing services through one's business is also important. When the concern is about a social work colleague, an amendment to the Social Workers Act to include quality assurance provisions and a duty to report came into effect on January 1st, 2020. So social workers have a professional obligation to report knowledge of conduct deserving of a sanction as outlined in the Act. the two pieces from the Act note. A social worker who has knowledge from direct observation or objective evidence of conduct deserving of a sanction of another social worker shall report the known facts to the registrar. A person who terminates the employment of or dissolves a partnership with a social worker based on direct knowledge of the social worker's conduct deserving of a sanction shall report the known facts to the registrar. So if you have questions regarding any of that, certainly consultation with the NLCSW may be helpful if you're working through these types of issues in your practice as a business owner or partner.
In summary, we want to provide you with a visual of all the social work resources that are available to you in your practice. These include the standards of practice, explanatory documents, guideline documents, and interpretive documents. All these resources can be accessed on the NLCSW website. Under interpretive documents, you will see ongoing and regular publications of practice matters, the ethical compass, and documentation matters. First publication of practice matters was in 2011, and the focus was on social media. These practice matters documents are usually based upon ethical questions or consults that NLCSW receives at the office, or even emerging trends in social work practice. They tend to be about 5 to 7 pages in length. Social work staff at the NLCSW rotate the writings of these publications. To date, 19 practice matters documents have been published. The topics have included electronic social work practice, accountability in professional practice, termination of the social worker-client relationship, informed consent, conflicts of interest, documentation, self-disclosure, and e-professionalism. The ethical compass and documentation matters are initiatives of the NLCSW Ethics Committee. These ethical resources tend to be shorter, with the ethical compass being about 2 pages in length and documentation matters being a half page in length. Again, these topics for these practice resources are generated by ethical discussions of the Ethics Committee and from ethical consultation with members. Since being introduced in 2018, there have been 11 publications of the Ethical Compass, with the most recent one being The Ethics of Disclosing Client Information. Introduced in 2019, there have been 5 publications of document matters, with the latest one exploring the question, how do I know if I'm recording too much or too little? When new resources are developed or an existing resource is updated, this information is communicated to the members in the monthly electronic update. Therefore, it's really important that you keep your email address updated with the NLCSW.
Thank you. And just to share that the Canadian Association of Social Workers has a private practice portal that provides a wealth of information on private practice, including a self-assessment tool to help you determine if private practice is right for you, information on choosing a business model, selecting an office location, tax deductions, cash flow, areas of practice, virtual counseling, marketing, standards and ethics, record keeping, health and wellness, protecting against malpractice claims, preparing a professional will, and the list goes on. So this is a great resource that you can access at your fingertips. We've also included the link there for BMS, which is CASW's professional liability insurer, if you have questions about professional liability insurance. And as Simone noted earlier, you can access free 30-minute ethical and legal consultations with them. So if you go on to their website, the CSW website, and go into the BMS, you can actually click on the button titled Professional Advisory Services, and that will give you some information about that program. BMS also provides webinars from time to time through the Canadian Association of Social Workers that you could find beneficial. For example, on April 6th, they facilitated a webinar titled Current State of COVID-19, Telehealth, Liability, and Business Insurance Considerations. And the recording of this session is available on the CASW website through their continuing education page. So it's just great to have all this wealth of information that's been compiled, just provincially as well as nationally as well. So that is the end of the official presentation. So we'll now open things up to some questions, and we'll try to get through the questions, but keep them coming in. Not seeing a lot there right now, so they're still coming in. So someone did ask that they just moved back to the province and have insurance with a company other than BMS Group. Is this an issue? I can just take just preliminary. There's lots of different. There's certainly groups that offer professional liability insurance. So it's just a matter of ensuring that whatever professional liability insurer you do have, that it's providing the accurate coverage for you and what you're doing in your practice. So, for example, does it cover interjurisdictional practice if that's something that you're doing? So that's just in terms of looking at it and what coverage you have. We talked in this presentation about the BMS, group, simply because that's an insurance program that's provided through the Canadian Association of Social Workers, and the rates are really good with BMS. So we included that information in the presentation. So if you're with another group, it's around analyzing if that particular insurance is meeting your need and is providing the coverage for what you're doing in your practice. I don't know, Simone, if you had any thoughts around that question?
No, that covers it, yeah.
Okay. Someone is asking, does the NLCSW recommend a fee for private practice? Simone, did you want to take that one?
Sure. So, well, the short answer is no. But yes, so this is a business decision, really, and so the NLCSW doesn't set a rate for private practice. Now, generally speaking, kind of in a basically a survey, or I think Annette and I had talked about that, it appears that the range goes from about $19 per hour to $180 per hour. But really, it's incumbent upon the social worker to explore the going rates and do a market analysis in the area that you're working.
Great, thank you. Also seeing another question there around, we talked about how the people have to look at their own technological platforms for service delivery, and if there are particular things that people should be considering as they do that. Simone, did you want to take that question too?
Sure. Well, I mean, I had to do that myself, and so there was a number of things that I considered when kind of shopping around and looking at various platforms. So those things that one can consider are, well, first off, private client privacy and the security of personal health information. And free programs tend to be less secure than those that would require a subscription. The internet connection and broadband, will the platform be supported in your community, in the community where your clients reside, and what about rural and remote access? That's definitely an issue for me because I work with people all around the province, Newfoundland and Labrador, and so there's varying internet speeds, and so that's important to consider. Is the technology user-friendly for client use, right? So you want it to be kind of as basic and straightforward as it can possibly be. And then you also got to kind of consider your backup plan in the event that the technology fails, because it fails, and the internet access fails. I mean, right at the beginning, in March and April, there was such a demand on computer systems that my program that I used happens to be good for remote areas, but it was still really struggling along too. And so there's an option as well to incorporate a phone line to keep the stability of the session. So the flow of the session isn't influenced, but then there's still, and maybe some video that might be a bit slower. And that goes to having an alternate option for connecting, right? Because you want a contingency plan with your client too, that if you are working together and you're at an important point of therapy and all of a sudden it shuts down, well, what happens next? So it's good to plan that in advance.
Right. Perfect, thanks. We do have another question. It's a two-part question. Someone's asking if you need to register your business with government, and are services tax exempt like some other health professional services? So Simona, I don't know if you want to take the first part and I can take the second part.
Sure. So again, these are individual business decisions that you really want to weigh the costs and benefits for yourself. And what you want to do is in looking into it further, you want to consult professional experts in that field, whether that's a lawyer or an accountant who can give you the best advice, reviewing the costs and the benefits and what will work best for you.
And with regards to the HST exemption, there is a piece in the Private Practice Resource Guide that NLCSW has developed, and that basically, notes that health-related services provided by social workers are HST exempt as per federal legislation, the Excise Tax Act. So it is recommended that social workers be familiar with this legislation and consult with their accountant and the Canada Revenue Agency just to ensure that you're interpreting this legislation correctly in terms of what services you're providing. Because it would be a difference, say, for example, if you're providing, therapy and counseling versus you're facilitating a community workshop, for example. So the links to that act and information is included in the Private Practice Resource Guide. So I encourage you to also follow up with that and have a read through those links, and consult with an accountant or the Canada Revenue Agency as appropriate. Hey, thank you. We also had a question pertaining to COVID-19. Certainly, was identified as having an impact on private practice, and what are some of the things that I need to consider? Simone, I can take that question if that's okay with you, and you can jump in too. Just want to say that, throughout the pandemic, the NLCSW did maintain and has continued to maintain a COVID-19 page on our website, and that contains valuable information for social workers and including information related to private practice. There's a Q&A document there. There's information about electronic service delivery, interjurisdictional practice, and so forth. So I guess some of the top things to consider, certainly one would be the monitoring of alert levels and orders guidelines for the medical officer of health. So just keeping abreast of that in terms of news and orders and guidelines that come from the medical officer of health and how that impacts on one's practice. We saw during the pandemic, of course, that, with the closures of the physical spaces, of physical private offices, to the reopening, to the mask wearing and physical distancing protocols, and all those different pieces and public health measures that need to be followed, can seem overwhelming at times to keep track of all the information, but it's a really good thing to know and understand these guidelines and orders and how they impact your practice. Certainly, the whole use of, like I said, the reopening of physical office spaces and the appropriate use of PE came up quite a bit. And also transitioning to electronic practice to ensure continuity of care, client-informed consent, and all those pieces. So people who, were used to technology, it was an easier transition, and certainly there were members who never had to use technology as much before in their practice who were now finding that they had to use technology, so looking at all those considerations and practice standards and ensuring that clients were also, informed from pieces that we would have talked about in the presentation around, risks and benefits and all those pieces that would be covered through informed consent. And of course, the self-care piece came up, and Simone facilitated a wonderful webinar during our time of COVID, and that maintaining, mental health in a time of uncertainty. and that webinar is available on our NLCSW YouTube channel. So if you didn't check that out live, you can certainly see the recording of that on the webinar as well. One of you had anything to add to that piece?
No, I think that's pretty comprehensive.
Okay. We still have a few more minutes, so we'll go through and see if there's any more questions. I think this question's for you, Simone, because you spoke to this in the presentation. But how often should I be accessing supervision and consultation as a private practitioner?
Okay, so there really isn't any specific number of sessions, and we touched on that one can engage in for the need of supervision, because it does evolve over time, and the need for supervision and consultation really can arise when faced with a complex or challenging dilemma, or when learning a new therapeutic approach or intervention. For example, when I did my cognitive therapy certification, in order to be certified, it was required for me to do a certain amount of training and a certain amount of clinical supervision. That was rather intensive over the course of 6 months. And that was at the beginning of kind of my journey through cognitive therapy and my certification, and that has lessened over time. But in order, to just use myself as the example, to maintain fidelity to the therapy, I do purchase group supervision, and I have the opportunity to continue to purchase individual supervision. So, and it also can it could be assessed as well that outside consultation may be in the best interest of the client. And I give an example of, even as working a private practitioner, I may be working with a young person who is also seeing, for example, a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And with the appropriate consent and informed consent, and having that kind of pathway cleared, that consultation as to what each person is working on with the client can be really helpful. So seeking informed consent with the client is really important, especially when talking across other service providers about a particular client. So reflecting on the need and planning for access to supervision it's a really good risk strategy. I like to talk a lot about professional self-care, and we talk about moral suffering and kinds of, when we're dealing in maybe areas where it can be somewhat of an ethical dilemma, or it can be a client with a high need or a complex situation, accessing good support's important. Another thing I do, since I've been in private practice full time for the last 5 years, is about every 4 to 6 weeks, I do a distance meeting with a colleague that's been a colleague of mine, a psychologist now for the last 15 years. And we do peer consultation. We use non-identifying information, but we support each other in our planning for clients, and also in some of the challenges that we face in order to maintain a clear head and good mental health in private work.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and Simone, this might be one for both of us, but someone is just asking around things they should consider when setting up an office for the first time. So I can start, and then you can certainly jump in as a private practitioner who has set up an office.
Sure.
I just want to note, though, that, in the standards of practice for social workers in Newfoundland and Labrador, it does note that social workers must ensure a safe and comfortable environment for clients in accessing private services. So, this really should include, paying attention to, location and security, for example, who has access to the office space, is it a shared space, is there an ability to securely secure client records. If you're operating from a designated space in one's home, does this allow for client privacy and security? Could it create boundary challenges, for example, and how you're going to mitigate some of those things? And then, COVID-19 certainly is presenting challenges around having a cleaning and disinfecting protocol that's also part of, maintaining an office and providing a safe and comfortable environment. If you want to add to that.
Sure. Yeah. I have been really fortunate with the office space that I've had where I am, and those are exactly the kind of elements, privacy and security and accessibility is really important. Clients have often said that where my office is positioned is that they do appreciate the privacy. It's actually behind a bank, so there's good security. There's cameras everywhere, just because it happens to be built in the infrastructure of the security of the bank. But there are a couple of other professional offices in the hallway, and I've developed a professional relationship with those businesses over the last 3 or 4 years, and we work different hours, so there's very little public, there's no public traffic flow right now because of the public health restrictions, but even before it was a quiet and a private hallway. One of the things too that I didn't actually consider when I first looked for a place and realized is that, in a business, when you rent a space, then it is, your duty to look at privacy, and one of the elements of that was soundproofing. And because of the business that was there before, soundproofing wasn't as much as a requirement, but it was because of the sensitivity and the health privacy of the work that I do. So I did have to bring a contractor in and soundproof all of the walls right up to the ceiling above the temporary ceiling, so it could be secured. And of course, that's an upfront business expense, which needs to be considered when setting up a practice.
Yeah, excellent point. Thanks, Simone. So if we didn't get to your question, I do apologize. We're pretty much out of time. So you can either feel free to follow up with us separately, or if there's something that we can respond to, we certainly will. But I do want to thank everyone for attending the webinar this afternoon, and hopefully we gave you some new information and gave you some helpful information that you can incorporate when you're looking at, your private practice, or if you're just looking at starting your private practice. So again, thank you, and if you could complete the evaluation, that would also be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you to Simone. Wonderful to co-present with you again this afternoon, and yeah, so hopefully everyone enjoyed it, and enjoy the rest of your day.